to sing. It was so amazing. Such great energy. It
I
was
was
a
reading,
special.
I was reading that there was a huge amount of people going up to Harabayat this year.
Yeah, I heard. Yeah, listen. There's always a huge there's always a huge amount of people doing something exciting. There's a lot more activity at Har Bayit over the last few years than probably when you were here.
Yeah,
But it's very tense up there. I was there one time. I never obviously went up to the top, but I went along the sides. And being a person wearing a kippah, you're not welcome.
yeah, that's what I gather. Yeah, no, I've never been up. Be interesting to go one day.
Did you see that little picture, that GIF file I sent out to the group yesterday of them building
Oh yeah,
the
yeah, the GIF. Mhm.
it was so good.
Yeah, very nice.
Hope everybody saw your text that we're having a class.
Yeah, yeah. Hopefully. Yeah, people are coming on.
Yeah, they're coming on. Okay.
Izzy, you have RZS as your name. That might be a remnant of, there you go. Got it. Good morning.
I control Rabbi Eisenberger. Sure. Good morning.
Okay. All right, gentlemen. I hope you had a meaningful Tisha B'Av, easy fast. Let's continue along in the Imrei Yaakov. In the WhatsApp group this morning, I've already sent out the third packet because we're going to be starting the last page of our second packet. So you should find that. And if anyone would like me to send it to them by email, just shoot me a WhatsApp or an email, and I'll be happy to do that as well. Okay, we're just continuing along in the Likutim, just different cases of where there's a blemish in the merchandise, where there is an indefinite amount of time to return a piece of merchandise that is defective. It's not like you have a certain statute of limitations, like when it comes to ona'ah. We say that if a person is ripped off financially, but the merchandise is perfectly good, he just paid too much, then there is a certain limit, a time limit that we had said, that you only have enough time, the time that it would take you to show it to someone who knows prices, who could set you straight. But you can't claim like a year later that you got ripped off. It's too late at that time. But when it comes to defects in merchandise, there is no deadline, but that's provided that you haven't used the item after you discovered the defect. And like the example I gave, it's not like Nordstrom where you can wear the shoes and keep walking in them for miles and then decide you don't like them afterwards. Okay, so but obviously, um, you know, let me put it to you this way: the halacha is the guideline of what is ethical in many instances. So even if a store like Nordstrom would take back the shoes after you've walked miles in them, would you really feel menschlich bringing back a pair of shoes that you know that they're going to discard? I mean, so you see that the halacha says, look, it could be that the shoe is not good for you. It could be that the shoe is even defective. But if you continued wearing it, then you've made a decision that you're willing to live with it. Unless maybe it's like for one evening where you had to go to the wedding or something like that. But but to continue wearing something or using a piece of merchandise and then to want to return it afterwards is certainly unethical, even if the store is willing, has a liberal take back policy. I certainly wouldn't feel comfortable bringing it back. I don't know. I don't know if Ron's on the call. He's in the textile business. Maybe he can. No, Ron's not on the call today. But anyway, another example that we had touched on right before we ended the call on Wednesday is Motzarim Shekasav Alehem Shirakad Shmona Yamim Yuchal Hakoina Lidrosh Tainas Mum. Let's say you have merchandise where there's a sign on the storefront or on the piece of merchandise itself that returns are only accepted up to 8 days. After 8 days, there's no refunds, no returns. So kasav b'shut marsham da hatnai kayam ve'en lahakona tainas muim ve'ihu da'afsid anafshe ayin sham dvar. So the Maharsham writes that whatever condition the seller wishes to make, he can say as is, no refunds, no returns. But this often happens with the store that goes bankrupt. They hire a company to do a sale of all of the merchandise at reduced prices. And they put up a sign that the only way that they can make money is if they sell the merchandise, no refunds, no returns. So the buyer himself knows that whereas normally when there's a defect, he has a right to return it. But here the seller is saying, you agree to buy this as is, regardless of whether there's a defect or not. The example that he gives is that you only have within 8 days to return it. But it would seem to me that there's no difference, even if you say, once you walk out of the store with it, it's yours. In other words, as long as there's full disclosure that this is not a typical kind of sale, then the buyer and seller can make whatever stipulations they wish. Okay, Yud Daled, Mun b'mekcho. If there's a defect in the merchandise, then the buyer is entitled to a full refund. And here's another example. Hamocher lechavero zirone gina. If there's a transaction on seeds that are meant for planting, their whole function is for planting. It's not, some seeds you buy, like you buy sunflower seeds to eat, but these seeds are being sold for planting purposes. Vizaran velot samchu. So the farmer John buys the seeds from the seed seller. He plants them and they don't grow. So chayiv hamocher ba'achrayusin umachzolo es hadomim shalokach mimenu. So the seller has to take responsibility. I mean, it's one thing, obviously you'd have to ascertain that it wasn't because of any neglect or negligence on behalf of the farmer who planted the seeds. He says, yeah, I did everything right. I planted them when they were supposed to. I watered them. I fertilized them, etc. And none of the seeds sprouted. So that's an indication that there was something defective about the seeds. I'm not a botanist, but I would venture to guess, like if someone, let's say, left the seeds out for too long in the sun or did something else in the processing of the seeds, he could inhibit their growth. And so if that's the case, then the buyer is entitled to a refund. Mishum shecheskasam lizriya ome. The seller can't say, well, I just sold you seeds. Some people want seeds not for planting. Some people want seeds because they want to put it on their salad or do other things with their seeds. So you can't demand a refund. So the halacha is no. The Shulchan Aruch says that when you buy seeds, there's an assumption that they're meant for planting, unless it's clearly indicated otherwise. Like I would guess, when you buy poppy seeds or sesame seeds from the store, then there's a good assumption it's not meant for planting. But it all depends on the context. The Shulchan Aruch says standard seeds are meant for planting. Avol masha torach hakona v'hotzi bizriyasan. Ein sarach hamocher litein lahalokeach. He says, but all of the expenses that the farmer made to plant the seeds, he may have had to hire a bunch of workers, spent a whole day plowing, a whole day fertilizing, invested in fertilizer, bought new soil, all of these other things, that the seller does not have to refund him. He says because the seller only has to refund the actual cost of the defective merchandise, not the other things that that the buyer invested in order to utilize that merchandise. So he writes, "Ulefi zeh nira duhu adin b'shar dvarim kim kagon imochar lo bad v'tofrim mimena beged." So let's say a seller sells fabric, and the buyer purchases the fabric and he manufactures a garment. And then it was discovered that this fabric is not color. I think it's called color fast. Is that the term? Where it, the dye in the thread does not withstand laundering. And so all of a sudden the garment fades. The first time you wash it, all of the dye runs out of the garment. Okay? So the question is, who's responsible now for the loss? So so the seller certainly has to refund the cost of the thread, but mikol makom eno tzarich litein lo mashahotzi avor tefiras habeged. But the cost of manufacturing the garment does not have to be assumed by the seller.
Rabbi, can I ask a question on those both examples?
Yeah.
Does it matter if the seller was aware of the defect when he sold it? That the seeds wouldn't grow,
It's a very good question. I suppose that if you could ascertain that this was a deliberate act of sabotage, then maybe the Beis Din would step in and impose a kenas, a penalty. But there's no distinction made in halacha because we normally don't address evil people who deliberately have malicious intent. There are sometimes people who try to get away with selling defective merchandise. That much we know. But apparently, even in that situation where the guy knows that it's defective, it seems that the halacha doesn't make a distinction. What's the source of this halacha? Let me just see. The source of this halacha is the Shulchan Aruch Siman Reish Lamed Beis Sif Chaf, which is the case of the seeds. But he's quoting from the Sma. He quotes a number of different responsa svarim that address this issue. If you want, we can just take a quick look at the Shulchan Aruch and see what the Shulchan Aruch says. Reish Lamed Beis Chaf. Let's take a quick look. It's wonderful to have all of these svarim at your fingertips. Okay, so Shulchan Aruch. Here, I'll share the screen with you so that you can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to be looking up Shulchan Aruch and going to Choshen Mishpat, and it's Siman Reish Lamed Beis. Sif Chaf. Hamochel lechaver zerone gina. Does everyone see that? Hamochel lechaver zerone gina shein atzman shel zeronim ne'echal v'zaran v'lo tzamchu. So here the Shulchan Aruch clarifies: if you sell your friend seeds, that the seeds themselves are not meant to be eaten. See, he clarifies that with language was not clear in the Imrei Yaakov. You're not selling him sunflower seeds where you can claim, I thought you were going to eat them. You're selling him seeds that are not meant for eating, such as, also, by the way, wheat kernels sometimes are eaten. People use pearled barley and pearled wheat, right? But if you represent these seeds as meant for planting, let's say for flowers or for other kinds of produce, and the guy plants them and they don't grow, he says, then you're obligated to make good on to the buyer, give him a refund, because it's assumed that he meant them for planting. But that's only if the reason they didn't grow was because there was something defective innately in the seeds. But let's say the reason the seeds didn't grow is because there was some kind of blight in the in the weather or in the soil. Let's say it hailed, there was a hailstorm after you planted the seeds, and that ruined the crop. Then the seller does not have to give a refund to the buyer, because he can claim that maybe the blight happened, the seeds didn't grow because of the hailstorm, not because of anything that I've done. Okay, so where's the Sma over here? So he quoted the Sma. He says the seller has to give him a refund. Paul's question. Paul's question is undertaken by the Sma. Even if the seller didn't know that the seeds are bad, are defective. Mikol makom havale la'asuke aidaite shemehin ro'im v'yafsid zaro. But he says, but that's the occupational risk that a seller of agriculture takes. He says, if you're a seed merchant, you are assuming a risk that your seeds may be defective. A certain percentage of your seeds are going to be defective, and you have to assume the responsibility for that percentage. In other words, I guess when you're a seed merchant, you know that, let's say, 5% of the seeds you sell will be defective, and you have to incorporate that in your business model, so that when you want to know your profit margin, you have to incorporate the fact that there's going to be a 5% loss. It's like, when you operate a warehouse, what do they always talk about? You have to factor in the cost of your business. What is it called, gentlemen?
Spoilage?
Shrinkage.
Shrinkage.
Called shrinkage. And what does shrinkage mean?
Shrinkage.
It means that there's going to be a certain percent of your merchandise that is walked off with, is stolen, right? I used to work at a warehouse, and I spoke to my friend was the guy who owned the warehouse, and he told me that's just how they factor doing business. Supermarkets are the same way also. You factor in a certain percentage of loss built into your business based on different factors. So one factor of the seed business is that a certain percentage are going to be defective, and you have to be prepared to refund the buyer. And therefore, you have to give him back a full refund, even though there's no seeds left. The seeds have already have rotted away in the soil. And therefore, the seller has no right to demand of the buyer, give me back the seeds, right? I can't give you back the seeds. The seeds are disintegrated now. They just didn't grow, but now they've rotted in the soil. But the other investments that the buyer put into the planting of the seeds, the fertilizer, the water, the labor, and all of these other things, that does not have to be returned to the buyer, because the seller can't assume that level of responsibility. I suppose, going back to Paul's issue, if you could ascertain that there was some kind of deliberate malicious sabotage of this guy's business, then a Beis Din would have to step in and say, okay, this is an uncommon circumstance. We're going to add an additional penalty. But according to the letter of the law, there's no claim over there.
Rabbi, it seems like the middle ground of neglect. You didn't do proper quality assurance testing, or you didn't do what you meant to do before you sold product. That certainly wouldn't incur additional costs of what was spent by the buyer.
Yeah, listen, you have to assume that in many of these cases, we're operating under the assumption that a merchant wishes to retain a certain reputation. And so it's unlikely that he would deliberately sell defective seeds. But I could certainly hear it happening in other situations, especially when you're talking about machinery. Let's talk about huge issues. Let's say I get a government contract to supply the government with a certain kind of axle, or a certain kind of hinge, or a certain kind of
A widget,
a widget,
the good old widget.
right? A widget for their space program, right? And because I use shoddy material, they shoot a space shuttle into space and it ends up exploding. I mean, that they blamed, what was it, the C ring or the O ring that they blamed the space shuttle's explosion on had to do with one simple part. I mean, the repercussions of providing someone with defective merchandise or defective design can be catastrophic sometimes. So you have to, I don't know I don't know to what extent this halacha applies. I mean, if a person manufactures a defective material, right, and then someone, let's say he manufactures a defective vehicle and someone dies or a group of people die as a result of that defect, we know that in American and Canadian law, there is legal recourse. There's wrongful death lawsuits all the time. You manufactured something, it was defective, the seatbelt was defective, the airbag was defective, the
Pinto.
column, what?
The Pinto car,
The
when
Pinto.
it was rear-ended, exploded.
That's right. There you go. Right. Most people won't remember that, but you do, of course, because it was a long time ago. But I remember that too. Yeah. What Ralph Nader, I think, called it a coffin car or something like that. He called it, yeah. But anyway, yeah, unsafe.
So, Rabbi, I have
at any speed.
I have a question about this.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I happen to be in the seed business, so.
Oh, I did have no idea.
Basically, seeds don't have 100% yield. It's an accepted thing in the industry. It's actually between 40 and 60%. And so when you sell seeds, everyone knows that they're not all going to sprout. Right. I think we all did the experiment in school where you put in a bunch of seeds, some of them don't sprout, and then you see the thing go. 100%. So it just seems, I guess if you're selling them and everyone assumes that, then you're not really replacing any. I mean, it's sold as is. Do you think I have to change the policy now?
No, you don't, because there is, like you said, there's an acceptable margin of yield. Let's say the market standard, it all depends on what the market standard is, right? Let's say the market standard is that whenever you plant, you typically 75% of the seeds will grow and 25 will not grow. So if you are abiding by market standards, then I don't think you have to worry. Or let's say there's a margin between 60 and 80%, okay? As long as you're within those margins. But let's say the seeds that Wayne sells only have a 25% yield. So then obviously there's a defect in your product, and you would have to, the Beis Din would have to calculate what kind of refund you're entitled to. And that's not really explicit in the halacha, but as long as you're staying again with fair market standards, then I don't think this halacha would apply. But that's great that you're in that business, because you could address this halacha directly. I thought you were in home care. I had no idea.
Then because if the fact is that if you ship seeds and none of them grew, like the yield was terrible, then we would return them all. We would replace everything if that happened.
Yeah, because that's a sign that there was something defective, right? Okay, and then let's go to the last part of the Likutim. Of shachut shenimkar v'nis'or bo she'ela. Let's say you're a butcher and you sell a chicken, and after it was already sold, there's a shaila that arises in the kashrus of the chicken. You're not sure whether the shoichet at the time when he shechted that chicken had a correct knife, or maybe there's some other kind of question that arises because you find something in the entrails and you're not sure whether it belonged to that chicken. Sheka'es kvar lo niten levaro im harya kosher. At this point, there's no way to determine whether this chicken is kosher or not. Ein sarach hamoicher lahachzer hadomim machmas safek after asr laochlo. So here's an interesting scenario. From a kashrus point of view, the buyer is not allowed to eat that chicken. Because let's say in the shlachtois, after they shechted like thousands of chickens, they found some of the entrails were treif. But they didn't catch it initially. They only found it after the fact. These chickens have already left. They've already left the building. Okay. The chicken has already left the building. And so, and the consumer has taken it home. And then all of a sudden, Marvid or a Premier sends out a public notice. There is a suffix that arose in the chickens that were slaughtered last Monday, and therefore we cannot guarantee that it's kosher. So al pi halacha, the consumer is not allowed to eat it because it's a suffix, whether it's kosher or treif, right? Now the question is a Choshen Mishpat question. Does the consumer have a right to return the item and demand a refund? So it's ironic that here's the argument. The seller can always say, maybe the chicken is kosher. Prove to me the chicken is not kosher. And normally the halacha is hamotzi mechavero olav haraya, because whoever wishes to extract money has to bring proof. Now, from a public policy position, the slaughterhouse will always offer a refund, because they're basically telling the consumer, we can't guarantee it's kashrus anymore. They don't want to lose their reputation. So of course they're going to offer a refund. But technically, if there's not 100% clarity that this chicken is treif, so then the seller does, from a Choshen Mishpat standpoint, basically can argue, I don't know whether it's kosher or not. We know that one chicken out of 100 that left this slaughterhouse was not kosher. Was it your chicken or not? I can't say for sure. But you can't say for sure either. And therefore, since now I have the money, I am now the possessor, you must prove to me that the chicken is treif in order to be able to get a refund. That's the letter of the law. Aval im nitra vadai, after zerak machmas chumra bimekach tos. But if the chicken is for sure that the chicken is treif, and let's say the chicken is treif not because the technical law deems it treif, but let's say it's because of a chumrah. Let's say they determined that the beef the cow that was slaughtered was a kosher cow, but they had advertised it as glat, and now they discover that it's not glat, which means that there may have been some holes in the lung that were not large enough to deem it a treifa, but still don't make it, or not, I shouldn't say lungs, there were adhesions in the lungs is what I mean to say, that those adhesions do not allow us to call it a glat animal, but nonetheless, it's kosher. So he says there, the consumer is entitled to a full money back, and under all circumstances, because he bought it under false pretenses. He bought it under pretenses that it was glat, and it turns out not to be glat. Kevin dezeh barur the treifa machmas chumer, because now it's clear that what you sold me is not what I had intended to buy. So because what you sold me is not what I intended to buy, for me it's not kosher because I hold by this chumrah that it's got to be glat, even though technically it's still kosher, so then I'm entitled to a full refund. It's only when neither of us can determine for sure whether it's kosher or not, that's where we say that the purchaser has to live with it. And basically, it doesn't seem fair though, because when you purchase a chicken and it's got the stamp that says kosher on it, you assume that it's already been checked properly. So I'm not sure if this only applies to a freshly slaughtered chicken that you went yourself to the shochet and bought. It could be that maybe with larger packing houses, where they put the symbol of kosher on it, and then a question arises whether it's kosher. It could be that this halacha does not apply. It's an interesting shaila, but I don't think it's a very practical shaila. Number one, because maybe the law will change if they represent it as kosher when it leaves the shop or leaves the factory. And number two, in all practical situations, no slaughterhouse that sells kosher meat is going to refuse a refund if they are the ones who discover that there may have been a problem with the beef or the chicken that you just purchased. Okay? All right, any questions, comments, good and welfare?
If someone came to the Rav and said, "Can I eat this chicken?"
In which case? In the case where we're not sure if we found
Correct.
something and perhaps 1 out of 100 of the chickens that was slaughtered that day was not kosher?
Correct.
Yeah, and someone would come to me and ask if they could eat it.
Correct.
I would say no, because once there's a suffix that's inherent in a group of chickens, you have to assign a chumrah upon all of them. There is an interesting halacha that says that kol deparish meruba kaparish, that you're allowed to assume that when you have something that separates from a group, then once it separates, you can assume that it came from the majority and then it's kosher. So I think it would depend, a lot of it would depend upon whether all of the chickens were mixed together or whether they were all kept separate. If the chickens were all kept separate, then you might be able to rely on the principle of kol deparish meruba parish, that the animal separated and it's assumed to be kosher. But if all of the chickens were combined at one point, then I think that's what's called kol kavua kemechzal mechzadami. Then it has the status of being a 50-50. Okay.
We just scheduled for next week. So are we meeting on Monday, which I think is a stat day? And then what happens? Yeah. I think the Rav said that some days we might be off next week.
I don't know what days I'm taking off with my wife. I'm not sure yet. We'll keep you posted through Alan and Warren on the WhatsApp. Okay.
All right. Is it going to be a shiur on Monday though?
Yeah, that's what I'm not sure. We will keep you posted.
Okay.
Have a good Shabbos, everyone.
Thank you. Take care. Be well, everyone.